Hi, my name is Baird Welch-Collins, and I'm running for state representative in the 38th District. I've been a lifelong, and actually I'm a third-generation Waterford resident. I've been living in town my whole life, and my family's been around for quite a while. I'm currently student teaching at NFA. I'm a graduate of Connecticut College, where I got my BA in government. And I'm very excited to be running for this office. I think it's time that Waterford and Montville had a representative who was really focused on the needs of the district, who was really focused on going to Hartford with the explicit purpose of bringing back more ECS funding for the district, with putting an emphasis on the needs of southeastern Connecticut communities.
How old are you?
23.
Yeah. So what's motivating you at a fairly young age to go for a state representative seat?
I've been involved in politics actually for quite a few years. I ran for RTM the first time in 2015, and I ran successfully in 2017. I'm also the treasurer of the Flood and Erosion Control Board in Waterford. I've been interested in politics for a while. I think it's important for young people to get involved right now in Connecticut politics, because we are seeing a mass exodus of young people from Connecticut, right? There's a lack of affordable housing. There's a lack of jobs. There's not the opportunity here that I think a lot of young people would like to see. I love Connecticut. I'm really invested in this region. This is where I would like to spend the rest of my life. This is where I'd like to be employed. I think it's important to stay and fight rather than cut and run. I'm interested in getting up to Hartford and giving a young perspective on how we can keep the jobs here, keep the people in Connecticut.
What would you say to those people that he just doesn't have the life experience to kind of go up there and know what working families are dealing with and what the important issues are? How do you address the experience concern you might get from
Sure.
some voters?
Yeah. Well, in my time in Waterford's RTM and on the Flood and Erosion Control Board, and even before when I was running for office back in 2015, I've been meeting people. I've door knocked thousands and thousands of doors. I've talked with the voters. I know the kinds of issues that they're dealing with. I'm very fortunate to have spent my whole life living in Waterford. I'm very familiar with this area. I'm very familiar with the people living here. I think that experience is important, but I think that it's also important to elect people who have an earnest desire to make change happen and make that be positive change.
And what, if elected, would you bring to Hartford as ideas to try to stop the exodus? Whether we've seen it among young people such as yourself, and we've also seen it among a lot of retirees. They take the money they've earned,
right,
and they move it to another state. So, some ideas you might have on that issue.
I think the commonality is lowering the cost of living. Property taxes is certainly a large part of that. Connecticut has the highest reliance on property taxes of any nation or any state in the country. But I think also just making sure we have affordable housing for young people, making sure that we have affordable housing for seniors, I think that is extremely important. In terms of creating opportunity here in Connecticut, I think that it's really important that we bring back high-tech manufacturing training programs, we keep technical programs in our high schools and community colleges, and we work on bringing back the partnerships that we used to have between businesses and these educational institutions. Right now up at NFA, where I'm student teaching, they're just starting to introduce the manufacturing pipeline, which is a program where students that are interested in an expedited process to get into like electrician, professional technical jobs, they can go through an accelerated training program and go straight into an apprenticeship. It's been very successful. A lot of those students who would otherwise not have any kind of secondary education are going to work at EB, they're going to work at Pfizer's, working at a lot of places like that. I think it's very important that we explore all of those possibilities and we make sure that we have job opportunities and training opportunities for people who aren't necessarily looking for the typical four-year college experience.
Mm-hmm. Now, how about young professionals who do have a college education? A lot of them are opting to go elsewhere to get their career started.
Yes. I think that it's very important that we make sure that those people can afford to live in our cities, can afford to live in our communities. We're dealing with a situation in Connecticut right now that's not really relevant to my district, but is relevant to a lot of the urban areas where there's I guess that's where a lot of the mass exodus is centered from. That's where a lot of the businesses are leaving. I think it's important that we help those people, those young people, find ways to stay and work in Connecticut. I'm a big proponent of legislation that will give partial to potentially full student loan forgiveness to people who are willing to live and work in Connecticut for a period of 5 years. In other words, if you stay here, if you contribute to our economy, if you're a taxpayer in Connecticut, you're living here, you're working here, you're setting your roots down here, then we're going to help you with your student loans. I think that's a really good investment, both from a fiscal standpoint and just from a practical economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes our policies on education, how we distribute aid, it pits suburban communities, such as the ones you would represent, against the urban centers, who have different issues, high number of nonprofits they can't tax,
Right.
The problems that come with being a city. How might you approach that dynamic? On the one hand, you'd be representing one of those suburban towns. On the other hand, you seem to recognize that we need vibrant cities to keep the young people in the state.
I think it's important that anyone who goes to Hartford recognize that both are very important. And I think that they need to advocate and explain to the public that we have a shared responsibility. It's not in the interest of the suburban school districts to have the urban districts doing poorly and vice versa, right? There is a vested interest that suburban communities should have in the urban communities, and it goes both ways. They need to support each other and they need to work together.
We're asking everyone out, a couple of the major issues that are being talked about in this election. The biggest, arguably, is the continuing fiscal instability here in Connecticut. It seems like we're on a roller coaster of budgets that get kind of worked out, barely pass, and then the legislature returns and finds a deficit. This time the deficit's pretty large, projected at $4.5 billion, give and take over the first 2 years of the term that you would be elected to. Any ideas, any thoughts as to how the state might begin to tackle that issue if you were Senator Hartford?
Yes, I think that there is a tremendous amount of wasteful spending that goes on specifically at the interaction between the state and the municipal level. My experience on Waterford's RTM and on the Flood and Erosion Control Board has shown that there's a lot of unnecessary spending that goes on because it's so difficult for communities and municipalities to regionalize and share resources. And a lot of the property tax burden comes from that inefficiency. I think it's important that we send someone to Hartford who's going to be prepared to make regionalization a real possibility. And I'm not talking about something radical or crazy like moving back to county government, but like making emergency management services regionalized or making towns have the option to do so. Waterford and a few neighboring communities, we recently regionalized our animal shelter, and that took years and years to do because it's an incredibly difficult and arduous process. And those types of things are going to see very real, immediate returns on lowering the amount that people are paying in property taxes. I think that's a good area to start.
Do you see the need to reconsider the reopen labor negotiations? Kind of the two big drivers for this deficit are the fact that pensions are underfunded and the state is not trying to keep them solvent and catch up on the payments it should have made long ago. And the debt, the debt for all the schools that have been built, and you could argue maybe some of that should have been regional, but much of it wasn't.
Yes.
We were asking candidates, thoughts on will labor concessions be necessary, or have the kind of unions been asked enough already in that regard?
I think that the unions have been extraordinarily cooperative thus far. I think that if we're talking specifically about the pension question, I think that we have an obligation to not balance our budgets on the backs of the people that are working to support this state, to keep our state running. I think that that's an absolutely unreasonable expectation. There are a lot of creative ideas that have not yet been explored that I would definitely look to first before we look to demand any further labor concessions. One idea that I've recently been researching and hearing a lot of positive things about is using the state's real assets to finance the unfunded pension liability. This was a program that was used very successfully by the city of Detroit to pay off their pension liability. And, the Connecticut owns a lot of property, a lot of real assets that we really don't need. That would be a way of shrinking the size and the inefficiency of our state government while taking a sizable chunk out of that unfunded liability.
So you sell off these assets and put the proceeds towards bringing down the
pension liability. Essentially, yes. Yeah. Australia actually successfully used that as well, if I remember correctly.
Anything else? You said that you had there's other creative ideas. Anything else you wanted to share?
I mean, I think that other creative ideas need to look into how we can generate revenue and just all around cut down on costs and cut down on inefficiencies. I'm a proponent of, legalizing recreational cannabis. I don't think that that's going to be the magical solution that people make it out to be, but it certainly is going to help. If we're looking at that issue in particular, I don't see the major economic benefit being the profits that will be made, which will be considerable, but they really will just be a drop in the bucket. I'm more interested in looking at the money that we're going to save when we're no longer paying to chase down and incarcerate nonviolent offenders for marijuana-related convictions. It costs a lot of money to imprison someone and to put them through the criminal justice system for ostensibly no reason, and we could save quite a bit if we moved in that direction.
You're a student teaching right now at high school. What about the concerns? Some voice said if it's that available, it'll push down into the schools more perhaps than it does now.
I don't really think that's likely. If anyone out there thinks that keeping cannabis illegal is keeping it out of the hands of the high schoolers that are going to use it, it's not. It hasn't been working since the 60s. I think it's far more responsible to legalize it and try to manage it and put a lot of that money into programs to actually reduce its use among young people than it is to just pretend that it's not happening.
The Republican candidate for governor is proposed something fairly radical. He wants to return Connecticut to a no-income tax state. He says he'll phase this in over some number of years. Any thoughts on that proposal?
Yeah, it's unrealistic. And I would be very clear that I don't believe that idea and that way of thinking is limited to our gubernatorial candidate for the Republicans. I think that is the Connecticut Republican idea. I think that even if that's not attainable, something along those lines, it's essentially having a two-income household and asking one of the parents to stop working, right? Connecticut would be living well above our means. I don't think that if we just cut out the income tax, first of all, if we did, it would be an immediate economic disaster for working families, for middle-class families, really for everyone, especially businesses across Connecticut. But even if something like that was attempted, that would be moving exactly the wrong way. I cannot possibly see any way that would help Connecticut's economic recovery. I've looked at the budget. I've seen the charts. The income tax is the reason why our state is still functioning at the moment. And I think that looking down the road at better tax policies and ways that we can help Connecticut's economy grow is a smart idea. But I don't think that right now, while we're struggling to keep our budgets balanced, is the right time to start saying willy-nilly, we're going to chop a quarter of the budget off.
So it sounds like you would be open to some potential tax reform if there might be a different way of how we go about collecting the revenues to run the state, adjusting that.
Right.
That you think is a reasonable discussion to have. But
yeah, I think tax reform is a very reasonable discussion to have. I just don't think that eliminating the income tax is a reasonable idea.
Where would you stand on implementing tolls as a way of raising revenues to meet our transportation needs?
Every summer I drive up to Maine. I have a summer house up there, and I'll tell you that when you drive back into Connecticut, it shows. We are one of the only states around that doesn't have tolls. I think that my support of tolls is contingent entirely upon how they're introduced. If we put in some limited camera tolling at strategic places around the state, I think that's a good idea. I think the number is 42% of drivers on Connecticut highways are from out of state. We're located right between New York and Boston. We are the drive-through state. And I think that if we can use tolls as a means to improve our transportation system, that's going to be saving lives. Right in Waterford, we have the I-95, 395 interchange, and that is one of the deadliest intersections in Connecticut, right? One person, I think on average, pretty much dies there at least once a summer. It's constantly in the news. That is a very dangerous intersection. And that's just one example around a state that needs all kinds of improvements done to our transportation system.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say, oh, we'll get it done, oh, we'll do it. But the reality is, unless we have a practical solution for how we're going to raise the money to fix that problem and how we're going to raise the money to save lives, then it's not going to be done. I think that it certainly needs to be investigated further. There's this large, expensive study that's been conducted. I'm not sure that I agree with that study, but
Agree with doing that, spending that money on that?
Yeah, I don't
study?
think I agree with spending the money on that study. But I think that there are unanswered legal questions in terms of what we might have to pay back to the federal government in terms of how tolls are implemented. But ostensibly, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it might be the only practical way to finance improving our roads and lowering the gas tax. Something people aren't really talking about is that our gas tax is so high right now that a lot of primarily trucks, but also just regular people, they'll fill up their gas tank on one side of the state so they can make it to the other side. And that's costing us money. If we were to put in some limited camera tolling and we could bring the gas tax down, then we'd be bringing that business into Connecticut.
$15 minimum wage, would you support, oppose?
I strongly support a $15 minimum wage. I think that it's incredibly important that we build our economy from the bottom up. I think, though, that we have to go into a $15 an hour minimum wage with our eyes open and understand the negative side effects of a shock to the economy. I think that it has to be a gradual increase. I would support, for example, increasing the minimum wage over a period of 5 years. I would be concerned about the impact that an immediate rise in the minimum wage would have on small businesses in particular. I think that small businesses are the backbone of our state, but I think that it's in no one's best interest for people to be working a full-time job, sometimes 2, 3 full-time jobs, and still be living in poverty in Connecticut. That does not help our economy, that doesn't help our tax system, that doesn't help our cities, certainly. And I think that revitalizing our economy from the bottom up is absolutely the right way to go.
So the gradual introduction, would the major aim from your perspective be to ease it in for small business?
Right, correct.
Yeah. And any thoughts on indexing it at some point so that we're not having this battle to consumer price index or some other measure so it kind of goes up with the economy?
Yes, I think that would be a great discussion to have. I would like to see something like that eventually implemented.
And one of the other big issues in this campaign debate between the two sides is whether it's time for paid family leave or not, but we're hearing most Democrats mostly in favor. Republicans are concerned with the same kind of business concerns you voiced about the minimum wage. So thoughts on paid family leave?
Absolutely, 100% support paid family leave. We're surrounded by countries that have paid family leave. We're surrounded by states that have paid family leave. One of the big reasons why I'm hearing young people say, I'm leaving Connecticut, is because they don't want to live in a state where they're not going to have that option of having paid family leave, right? We need to make it attractive for workers to want to come here and live in Connecticut. EB is introducing, I think it's 4,000 new jobs over the next few years. We want to encourage those workers to come and stay here in Connecticut. We don't want them living in Rhode Island and commuting across the border. We need to make sure that we have that. And it's not just an economically smart thing to do, it's the morally responsible thing to do. My grandmother, a couple years ago, she came to live with me while she was in the last months of life, and I can't imagine how difficult that would have been if we had been unable to arrange care for her while people were working. Because, if you have a loved one that needs you there, and you're not able to be there because of your job, that's heartbreaking. That's unacceptable in Connecticut.
So there's a cost involved. If someone's out, they're being paid. A lot of businesses might have to, add hours to someone else's job, bring someone else in to get the work done. Especially a small shop. So how would you pay for it? Would that be up to the business, or is there some other way you would pay for it?
There are a lot of possible ways to pay for it. It's done different ways in different states and in different countries. I think one of the most popular ideas that's been proposed is it would be, a small trickle would be taken out of someone's paycheck, essentially, to be used to pay for it. That's a very popular idea. We'd certainly have to see where the discussion went in terms of the best way to implement it. We'd have to listen to the experts on that one.
Some Republicans have wanted to propose doing it almost like a 401k, leaving it up to each individual if they, perhaps with the company matching, if they want to set it aside and have the company can set it aside, it'll be there for them if they need it, but that would be making an individual choice as opposed to a state mandated program. If that was the debate in Hartford, how much you come down on that alternative?
I think that would be a very irresponsible. I don't even know that I would call that an alternative. It would just be what we have now, which is no required paid family leave under a different name.
Okay.
I think we need paid family leave, and I think we need it now. And I don't think that's something that I would look to compromise on in that way.
Okay. That's about all we had. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
I think you covered most of the issues.
All right. Well, thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.